Good evening, and welcome to the Parker Arts presentation tonight on the adolescent brain, addressing teen behaviors. My name is Robert Sanchez. I am a member of the Parker Cultural and Scientific Commission, which consists of appointed volunteers bringing art, culture, and science to our community through events like this one. These free educational presentations typically happen the first Wednesday of the month from September to May at 6:30 p.m. This year, though, we're also experimenting with 2 lectures on a Monday at noon. The Parker Arts Lecture Series covers a wide range of issues. We bring experts as speakers. For example, we hosted an expert on challenges facing migratory birds and another expert on drought-resistant gardening. In addition to tonight's presentation, we have a presentation on aging with intention on March the 4th and on Colorado's Last Grizzly on April the 3rd. These presentations are free, but we would appreciate that when you register online, you consider making a donation to help us continue our lecture series. I'd also like to encourage your membership in Parker Arts for the many benefits it offers. Go to parkerarts.org to learn more. Before we get to tonight's speaker, thank you for attending tonight's lecture. It's important for us. And a special thank you to anyone in the audience who performed in or assisted in School of Rock. You guys rock. Thank you for participating in that. The show ends on February the 10th. Thank you to Parker Arts staff, the production crew, Maggie Hubanks, and Kirsten Fletcher. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted to the Parker Arts website. Opinions of speakers do not reflect those of Parker Arts or its affiliates. Now on to the speakers. Tonight's lecture is titled The Adolescent Brain, Addressing Teen Behaviors. We've got Dr. Terri Tillis. She's a Professor Emeritus at the University of Colorado School of Dental Medicine and has a master's degree in counseling and a doctoral degree in health and behavioral sciences. Dr. Jesseca Manson is Director of PhD in Counseling, Assistant Professor at Regis University, and is a licensed professional counselor and owner of Align the Heart Counseling and Supervision. She specializes in youth mental health services, parent coach, and complex trauma. Dr. John O'Malley is chair and assistant professor in the Division for Counseling and Family Therapy at Regis University, teaching in the Clinical Mental Health Master's Program. Please welcome Dr. Tillis.
Okay, so welcome first of all. Can you hear me okay? All right. So how many of you are parents of teenagers? Ooh, lots. How many are grandparents of teenagers? Quite a few more. How many just have annoying teenage employees you want to understand better? There's a few of those as well. Okay. All right, well, hopefully we'll have a little something for everyone tonight. A little bit of a disclaimer, I'm not a neurologist, even though I'm speaking about adolescent brain development. So that's probably a good thing because I've geared this in a way that it's for all of us to understand, not neurologists. And just a little bit of background, I've been at the University of Colorado until I just recently retired at the School of Dental Medicine. So I prepared this material for our orthodontic residents, dentists who are becoming orthodontists, so that they could better understand their teenage patients and kind of get a better idea of what's going on as far as their adolescent brain development. And it's kind of complicated. So I'm just going to spend about 20 minutes talking about what's going on in teenagers' brains as far as anatomically and physiologically. And then I'm going to let the experts talk to you about how to handle some of those behaviors that are a result of this brain development. So there's basically 3 aspects we're going to talk about relative to what's going on in the brain. So we're going to review a little bit about puberty and some of the newer ideas about how and why puberty is happening a little earlier than it used to. We're going to talk about the neuroplasticity that's going on in teens' brains and in adult brains, by the way, but more so in teens' brains. And then just the last little slide about dopamine receptors to help us understand why teens get so much intense reward system from pleasurable activities. But the main idea is to help us all sort of gain empathy for adolescents and to realize that their behaviors have a lot to do with things that they really can't control. Oops, that was not good. Okay. These are the resources that I mostly used for this presentation in addition to some others. But this first book here, if you want to learn more or read more about this, I thought it was a fabulous book, very easy to understand, written in terms that really anybody can digest. So I would highly recommend that one. This one was good as well, but I preferred the first one here. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening in the age span of adolescence, which has, as you'll see in a few minutes, increased. It's become a longer time span than it used to be. One way to look at how long adolescence lasts, and this isn't the only way to look at it, and it's not necessarily a way that everyone would agree with, but one way to look at it is to look at the time span from when sexual maturity happens until marriage. Okay. Not to say that if someone gets married when they're 40, they've been an adolescent until 40. We're not really saying that. But it's just one way to kind of look at what's changed over time. So let's start with females. In the 1840s, menarche, so when females got their first menstrual period, was at about 16.5 years. They got married somewhere around age 20. So there was only 5 years span between those two events. By 1900, menarche age had dropped to 14 to 15 years of age, and they were getting married a little bit older, about 22. So there you've got a 7-year span. Jump to 1950, menarche dropped to was occurring more at age 13 to 14, and marriage at about 20 years. So again, about a 7-year span. Well, if we jump way ahead to now, the average age at menarche is 12, with a range of 10 to 16 years. And as you know, people are getting married a lot later, around the age of 30. Consequently, there's about a 15 to 20 year age span. And that's a long time. It's very, very different than the 5 years that we saw back in the 1800s. Again, not to say that you remain an adolescent until you get married, but it's just one way of looking at it. For males, the anatomic changes in the 1960s happened around age 18. They got married around 23 for a 5-year span. And if we jump way ahead to now, adolescents are having those anatomical changes somewhere between 15 and 18 years of age, getting married around 33 for a 15 to 18-year span. So I don't know how you all feel as parents, but I think there's some truth to the fact that they still kind of feel like our kids until they get married. And in some cases, for me at least, they kind of feel like our kids until they have kids. My husband and I have 5 kids. They're all between the ages of now 29 and 39 about, and we don't have any grandchildren. So to me, they're kind of like still our kids because they don't have their own families of kids. But, everybody's different in that regard. Another way of looking at adolescence is to divide it up into just age-based stages. So you can have early adolescence, 10 to 13, middle adolescence, 14 to 17, and then late adolescence, ages 18 to 21 and beyond that. So what gets this puberty process started? Well, the hypothalamus in the brain releases a hormone that activates the body's pituitary and gonadal glands. And so consequently, when that gets rolling, physical signs like breast buds and pubic hair can be apparent as early as age 7 to 9, which for some of you parents, you've seen that. For me, it still sounds rather early, but that's how it is now. So why is that? Why has it moved forward to a younger age? The classic response is due to better health and nutrition of both the mother and the child, and there's certainly some relevance to that today for sure. But we're going to talk about 5 other possible components that may also contribute toward earlier puberty. These aren't necessarily proven or believed by everyone, but they seem to play a role. So we're going to talk about those one by one. Don't worry about these arrows. I'm going to fill it in for you here. Okay, so one first way that puberty is sort of scooted along is that the hypothalamus, remember we said that's in the brain, stimulates a protein that's called kisspeptin. You may not have heard of that before. And it's interesting how it got that name. It was discovered by scientists in Hershey, Pennsylvania, where Hershey's Kisses come from. And that's why they decided to name it kisspeptin. So when kisspeptin is released, it leads to a whole cascade of neurochemicals. Those neurochemicals, I guess I should point here, stimulate the ovaries and the testes to produce estrogen and testosterone, so the sex hormones, which promotes sex drive, which leads to reproductive capacity. So I think you all are pretty aware of that. But what's interesting then is to look a little further and learn about a protein called leptin. Leptin is produced by fat cells. And generally, it's there to regulate hunger and appetite. What it also does, though, is that it can stimulate this kisspeptin, which, as we've just seen, then gets this whole process going along. Another factor to keep in mind is melatonin, which I know many of us have heard about because it helps to regulate our sleep cycle. It's a hormone, and it happens to suppress kisspeptin. So try to remember that. Try to remember these two components when we look at the next slide and learn how these are playing a role in speeding along puberty. So we know that today there is more obesity, and there's more obesity among children, young children, as well as teenagers. Therefore, they have more body fat. And as we said, leptin is related to the fat cells. And so kisspeptin is stimulated if you have more of these fat cells. And as we said, kisspeptin stimulates puberty. Additionally, we said that melatonin plays a role. Well, how does that happen? We know that kids today are exposed to more light. And why is that? Screens, more screen time. They're exposed to more light. Therefore, there's less melatonin, I guess, circulating, which decreases the suppression of kisspeptin, which means that more kisspeptin is being released, which is, again, moving this whole puberty cycle along faster. So those are two kind of societal circumstances that are probably helping to push puberty along. And just to review, today's children are fatter, they have more screen or light time, therefore they have more light cells and more light exposure, which one theory says leads to earlier puberty, or can. Okay, let's look at a couple of other possible contributors. Secondly, endocrine disruptors. So you've heard about chemicals that alter production and effects of various hormones in our bodies, one of which is sex hormones. Some of these endocrine disruptors also mimic hormones. These are found in plastics, furniture, pesticides, there should be a comma there, pesticides, hair care products, some meat and dairy items, primarily in the form of animal hormones. And these endocrine disruptors are probably moving this process along as well because they're affecting sex hormones. A third possible contributor, babies that are born at low birth rate, which happens for a variety of reasons. Poor prenatal care, frequent multiple births, high blood pressure during pregnancy. There's a variety of factors that can contribute to low birth weight babies. And that can create that can create something called insulin resistance syndrome, which can lead to obesity. Now you might be thinking, well, why would a low birth rate baby tend to be obese? It's because their ability to process insulin is impacted. And so again, we've already said that obesity, fat cells, helps push puberty along because of earlier release of sex hormones, and then you've got, as I just mentioned, earlier puberty occurring. Okay, let's look at some other possible contributors. Stress might be one. Stress releases cortisol, and cortisol can contribute toward both obesity and some DNA damage that can accelerate aging. So kids or teens who are in, young children who are in high stress situations, that may be contributing to pushing puberty along. This one I think is really interesting. This is the last one contributor that we're going to talk about, father absence. So girls growing up in an environment where there's not a father or a stable sort of male individual in the household may have exposure to multiple unrelated males. Just they may, not all of them do, but they may. And if so, it may be that there is, this leads to pheromone release, which also stimulates puberty in girls. So there could be a lot of societal factors that are playing a role. Interestingly, this early puberty by 7 to 9 years of age varies by race and cultural influence. So not as common in white girls as in African American girls. And again, some of the reasons are more societal related than they are to genetic probably. And so that would be things like endocrine disrupting chemicals, maybe in some of the hair products that African American girls use and white girls don't, obesity, and situations where there's a lot of childhood stress. So there's probably other reasons as well, but a pretty big disparity between what you see with white girls and African American girls, which I think is fascinating. So to just sort of summarize then, obesity, artificial light, endocrine disruptors, premature births, family stress, and earlier exposure to unrelated males, all of these could play some role in puberty happening earlier. These societal happenings are probably going to continue, and who knows if marriage is going to become happening at an even later age perhaps than the early 30s. If all these things continue, then maybe there'll be an even earlier onset and longer puberty. Now the question becomes, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And to some degree, I guess it depends on how you look at it, but let's take a look at that. Early maturers tend to be treated differently by others, and this impacts how they feel about themselves. It also impacts, how they act. They might tend to hang out with older peers. They might start trying behaviors that are usually associated more with older individuals, could decide or could start to kind of disengage from school. So let's look at girls in particular. If they're going to be getting if they're an early mature and they're going to be getting maybe attention from males earlier than they're ready for, could lead to anxiety, panic, eating disorders, variety of kind of different effects. Early maturing girls may also experience or decide to sort of escape into substance abuse, other disruptive behaviors, maybe eating disorders. And just from a purely physiological standpoint, starting periods at an earlier age just physiologically increases the risks of breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and metabolic syndrome. So it's not a good thing in that regard. Looking at males, for early maturing boys, sometimes that's a good thing because they get kind of an ego boost. They're maybe taller, maybe bigger, maybe stronger, and therefore perhaps better in athletics. The downside is they do have an increased risk of testicular cancer because of hormones kind of circulating earlier. For late maturing boys, it's problematic because probably one of the main things is the last one here, bullying. They may decide to participate in high-risk behaviors to sort of try to appear older or more risk-taking. Depression, may have more parental conflict. It really depends a lot on the individual, but the point is, not all of these effects are necessarily very positive. This is just some sort of interesting down the road signs of having a long adolescence. At age 25, about 70% of 25-year-olds are working full-time. About half are still living at home. About 50% are still in school. About 3/4 are still receiving money from parents. And a quarter of them, and I think the statistic is even a little higher now, may never marry. Very different from how it was when I was 25, long time ago, decades ago. If you were still living at home, you were probably kind of a loser. If you were still in school, that would be pretty weird at age 25. And if you were receiving money from your parents, you were definitely a loser. But not like that today. I mean, things are different now. And they're kind of more dependent on parents for longer, potentially. This next little bit of information is from 2017, so it's a little bit dated, but I couldn't find anything any more recent. And I still think it's rather interesting. At that time, at least, and of course that was pre-pandemic, but at that time, about a quarter of adult children thought they should call their mothers at least once a day, and about almost half of them did. And about the same number, about a fourth of them thought they should call a few times a week, and about almost 40% of them did. And then 12% thought they should be in contact once a month or less. Again, when I was growing up, it was probably more like 12% was probably more the norm. But, it's different now. So kids sort of don't move on maybe quite as quickly as they did back in my day is sort of the outcome there. So that was the part about puberty. Now we're going to talk for just a second about something called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity really basically means that our brain has all these pathways that are created in there, and teenagers have a lot of these pathways that aren't very organized. It's like circuitry that isn't functioning in a real organized kind of manner. And what we know now is that even as adults, and this is what's referred to as lifelong plasticity. Even as adults, our brains are still remodeling in that way, but not to the degree that they are with teenagers or adolescents. For teenagers, it's almost like they have several streets and avenues and so forth that are just sort of all over the place. And as you get to be an adult, and your decision-making abilities increase and your ability to think strategically increases, then those circuits become fewer and more organized. And to see what that looks like, well, that's what I just explained, so let me move on. What that looks like visually is what you see here on the bottom. And this is 6 years old, but even as a teenager, it would look even more so kind of all these jumbled around networking circuits. And then if you look at an adult, they've become what we call pruned. So you kind of get rid of the circuits that aren't serving you well and that don't sort of lead to logical decision making. And everything becomes quite a bit more organized and pruned. So until that adequate pruning process occurs, teenagers, as we know, can be more easily excited, more easily emotionally aroused. They are prone to getting upset and angry, and this can lead to risky and reckless behaviors, which I think our next two presenters are going to really focus on. Once that pruning happens and some of these executive functions start to develop a little bit better, which happens in the prefrontal cortex, then that will prevent an individual from acting on every feeling they have. And the self-regulation skills start to kick in. And I think this is a really great analogy or metaphor about what goes on in the teenage years. Adolescence is like driving a car with an overly responsive accelerator, but with poor brakes. And so you can probably kind of see how that happens with teenagers. And this helps to explain why. And then the last thing I want to mention is dopamine receptors, which are in the brain and in some other parts of the body. During puberty, there is an increase in dopamine receptors. And dopamine receptors are related to the pursuit of pleasure and reward. When something feels rewarding, there's a dopamine rush, and you want more of it. You want more of that feeling and more of that reward. And so this is related to intense teen pleasures, sensitivity or desire, I guess you could say, for alcohol, nicotine, and opioids. In this active dopamine receptor phase, there's a lot of seeking of physical rewards, social rewards, and the pleasure and payoff that you get from sex, mating, and reproduction. So it's all kind of understandable from a physiologic standpoint. So hopefully this helps you kind of get a better understanding of a lot of processes that are going on in a teen's brain. And so now I'm going to turn it over to the experts who can tell you what to do about it, hopefully.
Thanks so much, Terri. No worries. Thank you. Perfect. All right. So here's, the risk-taking behavior. This is probably what a lot of you are struggling with. And certainly, anecdotally, I think John and I see a lot in our clinical practice right now. So we're going to be diving into this and giving you ideally some really practical strategies of how do we navigate this. And so we wanted to kind of start by talking a little bit about ourselves. So I can jump in and just say a little bit, we carry a lot of roles in the work we do, but I also think that lends really well to talking about this topic and understanding how to support adolescents and teens. So I am first and foremost, I think in relationship to this, a parent. I have a 4-year-old, so mine is not there yet. I'm already terrified of when he hits that age. I'm not sure there's anything more humbling than being a parent, so I think John and I can both relate to that. We also are clinicians, and so for me, I work with individuals across the lifespan who have experienced trauma, but I do work with a lot of teens. I also work with community partners, in particular in Adams County, in relation to teens who have ended up in corrections or in the criminal justice system as a result of risk-taking behaviors. The other piece is that we're trainers. We train counselors, and we train mental health professionals to work with adolescents. So all of those things you'll kind of see us move in and out of as we're talking about it, but I think we can't separate ourselves from our personal experiences as parents as well. John, you want to jump in and introduce yourself?
Yeah, and I'm John O'Malley. I'm the chair of the counseling department at Regis University. I'm also a parent. I think the hard thing about what we're talking about today is teaching you all how to do it and implementing it as we do it ourselves. I tell Jesse all the time, the jury's still out in 20 years. Either our kids are gonna be like the coolest, most like secure, awesomest kids ever, or they're gonna be really messed up. So
it's probably not the most uplifting.
Yeah.
But all right. So just to give you an overview of what we're going to talk about, risk-taking behavior as a developmental process. So that's a big part of what we'll be discussing, is that as nerve-wracking and anxiety-provoking as it is for us as parents, it is a part of teens' developmental process. What drives risk-taking behavior? What's some of the research existing on risk-taking behavior, and how do we incorporate that into what we do as caregivers? Skills for relationship building and positive change. How do you respond when your teens take risky behaviors into their own hands? And how do you build community and resources to ideally support teens in building relationship, in developing in healthy ways, and in avoiding some of those really consequential risk-taking behaviors?
So we have to acknowledge like the reality. Our kiddos, our children, our teens, they have to take risk-taking behavior in order to grow. So even just yesterday, I get a call about my 2-year-old from a friend picking them up at school, being like, "Are you here at school right now?" I'm like, "No." They're like, "Maribel's out in the hallway by herself. She snuck out of the classroom in school. She was like just walking in the hallways." We've addressed that with the school. But like those are things she does, right? She takes those sort of risks. How do we approach those things? We approach them by naming, that must have been really scary. So, because she's still kind of learning the words and things like that. So when we address those things, we have to stay regulated ourselves, but acknowledge that those things are going to happen. Just make sure to create enough container in which we can catch them when they fall a little bit.
Yeah, really just, when we lead into this, it's easy for us to sit here and say to you, and I recognize that with every family I work with, it's easy to say, oh, do this, it'll be okay, and we just want to acknowledge parenting is really hard, and it's really stressful. And I think of all the things we could talk about, we didn't even want to spend much time showing you all the research on what teens are facing right now, because I think you all know. They're facing a lot of incredibly hard things. This generation is just facing unprecedented stressors, social media, connection to devices, increased violence in schools, substance use, you name it, right? So I think we came in with the knowledge that you know that because you're seeing it, you're trying to navigate it with your teens. And this is really hard. It's really nerve-wracking. And so we just want to acknowledge that as we move through trying to give you some support in how to do it. So setting the tone, some of the things that I would want to start with, because I think certainly, again, John and I as colleagues talk a lot about our stressors with our kiddos and their challenges, but to just set the tone first of all before we jump into how to manage these, to say risk-taking is actually a very normal developmental process. The hard part about this is, especially in today's day and age, it's very stressful, right? There are big implications for our kids. Implications are more lasting with things like the internet, and so that makes it hard, but at the same time, it is a very normal developmental process. There is a difference between healthy and unhealthy risk-taking behaviors. So part of what we want you to think through and understand is that there's actually healthy risk-taking as well, and that's very important for kids to experiment with. The research shows that risk-taking is low in childhood. It increases around puberty. As you can see from what Terri described, makes sense, right? Hormonally and neurobiologically with what's happening. And it peaks in late adolescence. So all of that to say, what I want you to hear is it does get better. It is very natural, and it will start to naturally decrease for most kids. The other thing that the research shows is that parent-child conflict is very common in adolescence. I have a lot of parents and families who come in with a teen who feel like they're the only ones. They feel like they've failed somehow. They feel like no one else understands what's going on. And so one of the things we want to point out is that actually this is really common. Conflict is very common. Teens are building autonomy. They're developing. They're experimenting with how to make their own decisions. And with that comes a lot of conflict with their caregivers, whose job is to keep them safe. All right, so thinking about drivers of risk-taking behavior. One of the primary drivers in the research that's proven through empirical data is the desire for connection. You all probably know this, right? I can guarantee, and I'm curious, how many of you had a conversation with your teen of why would you do that? And it was to fit in with peers, right? Yeah, absolutely. So it's really interesting that really one of the primary drivers is just the desire to connect with a peer group. Some interesting research I wanted to point out is that actually risk-taking behavior coincides with social connection and craving. So there was actually a connection between what we consider pro-social behavior, or behaviors that are positive, are collaborative, are focused on the greater good, things that we want to see teens demonstrating in order to become great citizens, right? Those behaviors actually coincided with risk-taking behaviors on days that teens were craving social connection. So while risk-taking behavior is scary, it actually also drives and promotes a sense of community and promotes some of the really healthy developmental things that we want teens to be doing. Autonomy and exploration. So a big piece of this is teens naturally, again, in that developmental process, starting to think about, I want to make my own decisions. I want to try this out. As you all know, again, that's where we kind of see that phenomenon where, Lord help us, when we say, I don't want you to do this, that's an automatic invitation for them to try it, right? And so that exploration and that autonomy is a big piece of this. And finally, it does need to be addressed. One of the other big things I see is that often teens are using escapism or numbing. So I do absolutely have teens in my practice who are struggling with significant risk-taking behavior that is related to significant stressors and conflict in their homes. So that might be conflict and attachment challenges with parents. It might be substance use that's occurring in the home. And it also might be that they have siblings or other family members who are struggling and causing significant stress in the home. So those are all things to be aware of that can contribute to teens pursuing risks as a way of numbing and of getting that dopamine hit somewhere else when their home environment is distressing.
So we want to look at when we see those risk-taking behaviors, once we regulate ourselves, because we want to keep those around us safe, is looking at what the unmet needs are. And that's one thing you can think about, is if you're noticing folks taking that and folks are safe and you've calmed your own nervous system, because when I notice that, my heart starts to race, is like really thinking about what are the unmet needs not being met that behavior is seeking to communicate.
Absolutely. I'm curious, thinking about this for you all with your lived experience with your teens, what other factors do you see that you think might contribute to risk-taking behavior, or any anecdotes? We're all ears. Surely, you all came in here for a reason. Like, some of you have had to have these experiences. That's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. Absolutely. So, I think there's an enormous mental health boom right now as a result of COVID. It's unfortunate that took something that significant for us to recognize the connection between our mental health, our behavioral health, physical health, but absolutely. And so I should have included it in here, but actually Dr. Tillis got in contact with John and I through an article we wrote for the Denver Post Hub. So you can look this up online. I can certainly provide it to Dr. Tillis as well, so that can be a resource for you all. But in that article, we talk about the statistics of mental health for teens right now, and they're awful. And we've seen a significant increase in, it's unfortunate to say, but in self-harm, in suicidal ideation, in suicide attempts, in anxiety. And so that has, significantly increased for some particular, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, but some of them it's almost doubled since the pandemic. And so 100%, again, when we think about connection, social isolation was horrible for all of us, right? So that's a huge piece. We've seen a huge spike, just I think anecdotally in our practices and in the literature, on anxiety. Anxiety is an enormous problem right now. Separation anxiety, students becoming anxious going back to school, of course, substance use. The other thing to be aware of for you, even for those of you who are mentors in the community to youth, is that during COVID, we saw a dramatic spike in things like domestic violence and abuse in the home. So people, children who might have had a bit of an escape or reprieve from stress, parents who were getting a reprieve from the stress of having their children in the house all day, suddenly that was gone. And so there was a big increase in family violence in households. So I think that's absolutely a contributor too. So yeah, great point. And I think we're going to continue to see that. I even think on the side of our kids' age that we're seeing developmental shifts and delays in development for young children as a result of this. So it's wild, and we're going to continue to see in the literature how that develops. So thank you for sharing that. All right. So what does the research say? Risk-taking behavior is impacted by level of parent supervision. Sounds right? But what's interesting about this, again, if we look at the literature, is actually that we want to adjust our parenting practices to the developmental stage of the child that we're working with. So thinking about this, what the research shows is that children who are in younger to mid-adolescence benefit from tighter supervision, right? So being more hands-on, maybe more boundaries, more regulation of what's happening in their life, at school, at home, extracurricular. As they get older, there is a correlation between higher levels of supervision for older teens and higher risk-taking behaviors. Anecdotally, some of you have probably seen this, right? This is that idea that if we clamp down too hard on older teens who should developmentally be taking more risks, that they can actually retaliate and increase their risk-taking behavior. Now, you do have to balance that with the pattern of risk-taking behavior that your teen has taken, right? So we recognize for some of you there's already been evidence that your teen is struggling with making safe decisions and using risk-taking in an effective way. But that is something to keep in mind, is that the more you can think about your child's development and align the level to which you're supervising them, the level to which you adjust consequences, things like that can be really helpful. Anything you'd add to that, John?
So I helped coordinate a program through Northwestern University and Johns Hopkins University for youth, probably like 16 or 17 years old. The program through the Center for Talented Youth was really kind of came out of like kids that were younger, maybe second grade or third grade. Well, they started doing those later adolescent programs, but kept the same protocols, which were you need to be supervised at all times, like eyes on them at all times. Now I'm talking about 16, 17-year-olds. That's not developmentally appropriate. So we would see, like developmentally, and I would try to communicate this to the program, the reason we're seeing developmentally inappropriate behavior right now is because we're putting them in an environment to contribute to that. So we do have to intentionally look at how we provide the safety net, but encourage that. So this program was in Berkeley, California. I was able to get the program to let them go out on their own in Berkeley, California for an hour. We had things in place, not a huge deal, but for them in the legal department, they're like, ah! But then we started to see behavior get a little bit better. So that's kind of like it kind of playing out.
Absolutely.
The other thing we need to be mindful of, and I saw this because I was kind of seeing all the behavior through that program I just mentioned, is that the microscope goes on folks differently based upon the power and privilege they hold in their own identities. And so we have to be compassionate for folks. So, I work with, just working with clients where parents will go ahead and like really supervise their kid a lot more in risk-taking behavior because they know the consequences if they get caught is going to be a lot higher. So we have to be compassionate to that, right? Especially, caregivers of children of color. Like, it's just the research is really clear that the consequences to them in terms of the system's not treating them as well is there. So that's why we have to be compassionate to folks that developmentally might be putting a microscope on their kids a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's what we really wanted to add to this for you is thinking about your identities, your child's identities, and we want to just acknowledge this awareness that parenting practices might have to vary depending on those things. So there's a lot of research supporting the fact, for example, that children of color in the school systems are punished more heavily for the same behaviors as their white peers. The same thing happens in corrections with the law, things like that. But also thinking about gender, right? So how many girl moms do we have? Girl dads? Yeah. Right, so thinking about, we understand that those differences can feel really heavy, and we have to acknowledge that some of what you might be doing might be aligned with trying to protect your child, and that there are different consequences or higher risk of them being harmed when they do take risk-taking behaviors. The other piece that we'll talk a little bit about is also thinking about, there's a lot of research supporting building cultural resilience for your child. So pairing them with mentors who share identities with them, getting them in group environments where they feel a sense of belonging, that those are good ways to also counteract that and give them some risk-taking opportunities or some social opportunities that are really aligned with their identities and their experience. Alrighty, so thinking about approaching parenting and risk-taking behavior, we're gonna break these down in more detail, but to kind of give you some bullets that will kind of zoom out and give this bigger picture of what we're gonna be thinking about is considering development, right? So when you're approaching and thinking about how do I wanna support my child, how do I wanna respond to their risk-taking behavior, that you consider their development and where they are, especially again in this broad span of adolescence, knowing that it is growing so much, really thinking about how different that looks because it's such a big span now. Building relationships. So again, as a therapist, as a counselor, a lot of what I see is that a lot of this can be supported, not completely nixed, but mitigated and safely navigated when children have strong relationships with their parents, caregivers, school personnel. And so how do we build strong relationship in a time when there's so much conflict and turmoil in the household? How do we support risk reduction? So knowing that teens are going to go out there and try these risk-taking behaviors, how do we help them to think about making smarter choices? How do we help them to reduce the level of risk with some of the behaviors that they might be engaging in? And finally, how do we respond when they do take those big risks that could be have really negative consequences or could be really dangerous? All right. So one of the things that I have found is the most helpful, because a big part of what I do in addition to working in therapy with teens is I also bring parents in, right? So I get parents communicating with teens, teens communicating with parents, and I also coach parents on how do we approach this? How do we navigate these behaviors or these problems that are going on? One of the things that's really helpful, and some of you might have heard this, is the approach called motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing was largely developed in response to what we used to call, difficult clients or resistant clients. I don't love that term. I think people always have reasons for feeling resistant, especially in something as vulnerable as therapy. But this was kind of developed especially in response to thinking about things like substance use, something that's really hard to let go of. When someone's addicted to a substance, how do we work with someone when they don't want to stop a risk-taking behavior? Teens are very much the same way. So when we think about the brain's development, that dopamine hit that they're getting, all of their hormones telling them to take these risks, their desire for connection, telling them to stop doing these things is not going to fly, right? Many of you are probably here because it hasn't flown well. And so motivational interviewing is a great approach for this. To break it down, I tried to break it down to some really key steps, but the other thing I would want you to know is that there's a lot of good information and more in-depth trainings about motivational interviewing. So if this is something you're really struggling or at a crossroads, I would really encourage you to try and get some trainings, do some reading more in depth on this approach because it's been wildly helpful for me in my work with teens. So the first step is really expressing empathy. So one of the biggest things we talk about when we're training counselors, if you think about someone connecting with you, is first and foremost listening to their story and expressing empathy for what they must be feeling. I can imagine many of you have had something difficult happen in your life. You've talked to someone about it, and I don't know about you, but some of us have experienced someone saying, well, at least this didn't happen, right? Or, well, did you try this? And jumping into solutions. And that can be really off-putting. I don't know about you, but when that's happened to me, I might not feel like someone understands what I'm really experiencing. They might be throwing recommendations at me that I've already tried. So I'm like, you're not even listening, you're just trying to fix this, but you're just assuming I don't understand. It's the same for our teens. And so starting with listening and expressing empathy is key. So assuming that their feelings are valid, this can be really hard because, again, developmentally, when we think about that prefrontal cortex, things that seem small or trivial to us are life-ending to our teens. So remembering and really putting us in that space of even if internally we're going, this seems so silly, or I don't understand this, that to them it's very real. And it's a very big part of their world and their experience. Understanding with non-judgment, another really tricky one. And what I would say and what I often say to parents is this does not mean that you can't tell your teen that what they're doing concerns you or that it doesn't align with your values or what you want for them. But it means that you start by refraining from judging them as they're telling their story. So you don't jump in with judgment. Beginning to identify goals and desires. So this is where through listening, and this is the real key to motivational interviewing, is we are starting to look at and try to understand what did they want? Not what we want, but what are they wanting in their life? Because that's going to help us flip those behaviors on their head. So we'll get to that. So that's the first part. Express empathy, listen, reflect. And again, this is where we don't have enough time today, but if you can get more into this training, these are a lot of foundational skills that counselors use. So just reflecting their feeling in the moment, putting yourself in their shoes, listening, saying, I can imagine that was really hard. Sounds like you're really scared, you're lonely, you're worried about this. Just taking a lot of time to listen and to understand what they're wanting.
So regulation comes through co-regulation. Let me say that again. Regulation comes through co-regulation. So someone, if their emotions and they're having a hard time controlling them, we actually can help people. So here's a quick story to illustrate that. Any teachers out there? Y'all are a hard group to do trainings with. So I was up at Mapleton doing a training on this, right? And how they can use these skills in the classroom. And I had a teacher just raise their hand and say, I'm sorry, but this isn't gonna work, and just kind of coming at me. So I'm like in real time, like, they're coming at me. So I just started saying, it sounds like you really care deeply about your students and that like you just don't think this is gonna work. And they're like, exactly. People keep on doing these trainings and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, just sounds like you're not listening to. And like we keep going and the audience sees what's happening and this person's getting calmer and I'm like, time out. What was that like for you? And they're like, oh! They didn't even realize that I was using the skills in real time and that it worked. So I know that as like Dr. Manson talks about these, you're like, but like when you really put them into action, they work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really all of these are things that we do with one another, but they're extremely important. I love that you bring that up because this is the hard piece of our teens come at us really hard. They really do. I'm sure you all have experienced things that just...
My faculty come at me hard. You came at me hard last week. No,
I'm preparing for it, and I have a son who has an iron will, and he also has ADHD, and so we've got a long road ahead of us. And so I can just imagine what he's going to be like when he's 15, 16, and we have empathy for you, is what I would say. So thank you, John. So as you listen, right, again, this is where we come, let me see if I can use my, oh, there we go, fancy. Begin to identify goals and desires. That doesn't happen unless we really take time to listen to the child that we're spending time with. Out of that, the real gold here is that you develop a discrepancy. This is meaning that we identify where their current behavior or the risk-taking behavior they're engaging in does not align with their goals or their desires. And we're going to articulate that in a non-judgmental way. That's what's really key. Again, we're trying to present it very neutrally. And you have to balance this. It's very easy for me as a therapist to present it neutrally when it's not my child. I recognize that. But you're trying really hard to balance some of that neutrality in this moment. So an example of this is I have been working with a teen client who is engaging in a lot of sex very quickly with partners without knowing them well, numerous partners even at 15 years old. And so part of what I identified as I really listened to her and got to know her was that she wants affection, right? It seems obvious. She wants affection. She wants to connect. She wants to feel understood and loved. Part of what we started to talk about is she would tell these stories of these partners, and one of the big things she came back to was it was so awkward. And hopefully I recognize this is very TMI, but she was talking about like having sex with this person was so awkward, and then it didn't work out, and I was heartbroken. And so part of what we talked about was, wow, what would it be like to have sex with someone where it felt really great because you're really connected to that person. You know them, you know they care about you, right? So you can see where, again, I'm not immediately jumping on the train of don't have sex. I recognize she's not gonna hear that. But I do recognize her desire is to have that great feeling with someone who really cares about her, and jumping into bed with random people is not gonna fix that. That's not gonna get her what she wants. And so we've had these conversations. It took several months, but she actually has reduced and is now not jumping into bed with guys. And she's going on dates, but she's not having sex.
Good work, Dr. Manson.
What'd you say?
Good work.
Thanks.
Good
I appreciate
therapist
that.
over here.
But what I want you to hear, just to get that example of what this looks like, and that doesn't happen unless you spend a lot of time trying really hard not to judge them, trying really hard to listen empathically. And again, I want to acknowledge this is really tough because meanwhile, right, while this is going on, no matter how many times she was grounded, restricted, told these things, she was still finding ways to sneak out and engage in these behaviors. So I acknowledge and understand you're having to balance doing this non-judgmental, empathic listening while also going, oh my gosh, how do I keep them safe? Like every time they go out and do this, it's a very unsafe situation. That's tough. It's really tough. The next piece is going to rolling with resistance. So when we first start to do this, it is very normal and automatic for a teen or an adult client to become resistant at first because they're feeling ambivalent about change. They are starting to recognize, and they might hear you, that there's a discrepancy, but they're not ready to acknowledge it or act on it yet. So this is why we might empathize with reasons to remain the same, and we gently reaffirm alternative views. So an example of this with the client I was working with would be, I think we had conversations around, yeah, I understand, it sounds like a lot of your friends are having sex with lots of people, and they kind of make fun of you when you don't. And I understand that you're really wanting to connect, and you're just so lonely that sometimes it gets hard to think about holding out and waiting for someone that you get to know really well. And I'm just wondering, and I'm thinking, like, could it be worth trying? Like, what if you just tried it out? So giving that rolling with resistance and not immediately butting heads when they start to become resistant or they back out, right? They start to think about change and they go, no, I don't like it. We want to roll with that and try to know that, again, the less that we butt heads with them, the more likely they are to take change into their own hands. Anything you want to add to that, John?
No.
Okay. And then finally, give me just 1 second, y'all, sorry. Supporting self-efficacy. So as teens start to change, we want to, and this is a great behavioral marker for all kids, even young kids that I work with, is it's actually more helpful to praise the heck out of positive behaviors than it is to punish all the negative behaviors. So that's where with young kids, when they're not taking these really dangerous risk-taking behaviors, you might hear things like ignore certain behaviors and then praise when you see the right behavior coming up. It's very similar to this. We know you can't ignore those behaviors entirely, but you really, when they start to make good choices, you want to encourage the heck out of it. Notice it, praise them, support them, encourage them. Non-judgment with relapses in behavior. So again, this teen that I was working with, we would talk about it, she would want that, she would meet someone, she would have sex with them. Okay, so that didn't go quite how you want. What do we want this to look like next time? So again, as much as you can, recognizing and balancing, especially if in your role as a parent, trying to be non-judgmental with those relapses. It doesn't mean, and we'll talk about this later, it does not mean that there's not consequences for their behavior, but it means that you are not shaming them as a person for making that mistake. Is that making sense? Okay. And then empathizing without rescuing. So this is where, to some degree, you don't rescue them from the consequences of their actions, right? Again, we know that some of those actions have very long-term consequences, so I'm not telling you to not fight for your child or protect them, but that there are certain things you'll see developmentally where it's like, it's okay for them to sit with the consequence of this. I can empathize with them and again, be compassionate, not shame them, not be detached or cold, while also going, yeah, this wasn't a good choice, and here's the results of that. And I can imagine you're really frustrated right now, you're scared. Makes sense. Anything else you'd add, John?
No, what's our time right now?
Oh yeah, good.
I think we're academics, so we
could talk forever. Okay, perfect, thank you. All right, we'll go ahead, we'll keep rolling and hold questions for the end, so we'll give you all a chance there.
So yeah, like I said, it's really important to model, and I've learned so much at Regis just by hanging out with Jessie, because Jessie's a play therapist, right? So I get to see her teach students and model it, and then I get to go do it with my kid. It's great. But it's really important that we model. So you know how I just said, or not me, Jessie. Jessie was talking about those skills, right? You could go into the classroom and teach those, and that's step one. But it's even more powerful if they can experience it, right? Like that is really powerful when someone comes at you or they're not acting their best, that you actually give them a corrective emotional experience. You actually model to them how we're gonna be in relationship. Even though you're approaching me in a way that's kind of communicating, I don't wanna be in relationship, I'm going to communicate to you, I wanna be in relationship. So how do we do that? We make sure to check in with our own nervous system, make sure that we're calm, make sure that we're using those skills that Jessie kind of talked about in the slide before.
Yeah, so a big piece of this that I've talked about, and I think that is important, when we think about that self-regulation, the other thing I would want to add to this is you also, part of modeling healthy boundaries for your kids too is they don't get to scream at or abuse you either, right? So it's also can be really powerful to model, hey, we need to come back to this conversation when you can speak respectfully to me. Let's take some time apart. So doing things like that, apologizing when we mess up, which is actually a lot harder than it seems. I know that because I frequently apologize to my 4-year-old. But I think normalizing making mistakes, and again, when we apologize and own it comfortably, we show kids that they can mess up, and it doesn't mean they're going to be shamed. They're not less than, they're not horrible people. And to me, that's actually a big precursor to setting them up to being willing to tell you when they're in trouble. So I was really fortunate. I had a lot of challenges in my childhood, but I had an amazing mom. And my poor mom, because she was so amazing, man, I called her in some tight situations that I think took years off her life. She's still here, but and she's laughing at me now as I deal with my strong-willed child. But I think part of this is normalizing it's okay to mess up, because that also, my biggest hope for my son is that when he takes some of those stupid behaviors, because inevitably he will, he feels like he can call me. And he knows that I'll come get him, I'll protect him, I'll take care of him. And I think apologizing when we've messed up is one of those big pieces of modeling. Respectful communication, we talked a little bit about that. And then transparency in your own decision-making process. So I think really being transparent about the moments when you're uncertain, how you process through making certain decisions can be really helpful. The big thing I would say, we talk about do as I say, not as I do, but this is a really easy thing we forget with kids is they are really great observers. They are watching us. They're listening to what we say, but they're watching what we do. So what we do is more powerful than what we tell them they should be doing.
And so for Jesse and I talk about this, some of the strongest relationships we have been with kids that we have made mistakes with clinically. Now the goal is to reduce mistakes, not to make mistakes, but modeling the repair, you know what, I wasn't as empathetic as I needed to be right there for you, and you needed me and I wasn't there, I'm really sorry about that. You deserve better.
Yeah.
They just experienced what that was like. Now they're more able to do it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that's a big thing anecdotally I see with teens in my practices. I have a lot of them who, and parents are always trying their best. I really believe that. But a theme that I've seen with a lot of teens who are engaging in a lot of risk-taking behaviors is I hear constantly, I can't do anything right. It doesn't matter anyways, because they're really feeling beaten up in their homes when they make mistakes. All right, so how do we respond to negative or unhealthy risk-taking behaviors? Where possible and developmentally appropriate, allow teens to experience the consequences of their risk-taking behaviors. This is a really, really tough one, but there's actually research to support the fact that teens decrease their risk-taking behaviors as they experience healthy consequences. Again, recognizing I'm not saying let them go into a situation that could really be dangerous to them. But when they get in trouble or when they, an example with another teen was skipping class frequently and getting a bad grade, and they had to take a class over. Sounds catastrophic and stressful, but this teen was at that point where the parents and I both said, okay, she's fought them tooth and nail on this, and this is going to be the consequence. She now has to take this class over. In the grand scheme of her life, not going to be a huge detriment to her. She's going to be okay, but she's learning and experiencing the consequence of that behavior, and it actually sets teens up for less risk-taking behavior in the long run. Natural consequences tend to be more effective in building autonomy and an internal locus of control. By that we mean recognizing I control what happens to me. I'm not just a victim of circumstance. So what we mean by natural consequences, when I think about young kids that I work with, if a child is being mean to other children and suddenly they don't have any friends, that's a natural consequence of being mean. Right? So thinking about in any given situation, we have found that letting people experience natural consequences is more effective than making up a punishment, an external punishment. Is that making sense? So trying to find that where you can is really helpful. Processing the incident or consequences after the crisis when both parties are regulated. So as a trauma therapist, one of the big things I know when we talk about emotional regulation, say your child has been out till 3 a.m. and they just come home and you're arguing, not the time to process with them. Their prefrontal cortex, that logical decision-making piece, is offline. So it's not a good time for either of you to be processing and thinking logically about the situation. You want to wait until they're really calm, until they've had some time to cool down, you've had some time to cool down, and then you can process with them and talk about what were you thinking, right? And using choice language. So this is something from play therapy, but what I found is really play therapy are skills that can be used throughout the lifespan with kids. We just develop and update how we use those in a more developmentally appropriate way. So what I mean by choice language is phrasing things to kids in the way of, when you chose to do this, you also chose to have this consequence. So it's really setting up, you have the control here and you can choose the outcome. That also means you're responsible for your choices and what happens. Anything you'd add to that, John?
You know I always do, but we better keep rolling.
Yeah,
right?
for time. All right, so responding to positive or healthy risk-taking behaviors. One of the things I wanted to highlight and say again, as I mentioned earlier, is it is developmentally appropriate for teens to be taking risks, and we want to encourage them in taking the right kind of risks. So what does this look like? This might be asking someone out on a date. It might be taking a leadership role in their school. It might be trying a new instrument. It might be, to the degree you're comfortable. I'm terrified of heights, but rock climbing, right? So things like that you can promote. Help them identify opportunities. Again, by building that relationship, knowing what they're interested in, throw out ideas, offer to help them get to different things that might engage that risk-taking behavior, promote that dopamine rush without being involved in negative social activities. And process and encourage. Again, be that person that they can come to and talk about when someone rejects them, when they drop the ball on a project or a leadership role that they're taking on. Be there to process and encourage with them and help them to get back out there and continue trying. Channeling healthy expression and risk-taking. Nonverbal processing, we know of the adolescent brain. And this is one of the reasons why play therapy is successful and creative art and things like that in teen therapy are really successful. Even though they might have the verbal capacity to explain something to you, we know that because those neural pathways are still developing, they are not as good at articulating their internal world and their feelings through verbal capacity. So believe it or not, even though teens are very talkative, it's actually far more effective and helpful for them to process through nonverbal means. So sharing music with you, that's a great way to share with your teen and talk with them. What are they listening to? What do they like? Again, trying to approach it with non-judgment. I've realized I'm aging because I'm at the age where I'm like, what on earth is on the radio right now? I never thought I'd hit that, but here I am. But trying to be non-judgmental about it. Art, movement, outdoor adventure activities. So I've seen a lot of success for teens with climbing activities, equine facilitated working with horses, wilderness trips, things like that. And then, of course, individual therapy and even family therapy. Finally, building resilience, shameless plug, we are therapists, so we've seen a lot of success from counseling. One of the things about working with teens, as you all know, it's not magic. So really part of what makes therapy successful is I'm just not their parent. Let's be honest, really, right? How many of us, we tell our teens, we tell kids not to do something, and some other valued adult in their life tells them the same thing, and suddenly they're like, oh, yes. So just to say it's not magic, but it is really helpful. It helps a lot for them to have another adult to confide in that they might see as different than a parent figure. So counseling is great for that, but there's a lot of places you can get that. It could also be community members. So mentors, faith, spirituality sources, extracurricular activity, and families and friends, even another adult friend that you have. Anything like that they can connect with. And there's great studies showing even for children in foster care, for children with a single parent, that there's a huge impact by having just one positive adult, and it does not have to be a parent. Anyone involved in their life can have a very significant positive impact on them. So the last thing we would want to say in summary is that I love this quote about, if you all have heard this, about like a glass ball versus a rubber ball. So you all are balancing a lot. You have a lot of stressors. I know that. And so just remembering you're going to make mistakes. You're not going to do things perfectly. Your teen is going to make mistakes. But what are those glass balls that you can't afford to drop that really are going to have big consequences for you or for them? And what are the ones that it's okay to mess up? And just remembering that for both of you, because raising kids is really hard. Anything you would add to that, John?
That was just such a beautiful ending that, like, I would ruin it. So thank you.
Yeah, so, and we have some references here if you're interested in some of where we pulled our sources. But we would love to just open it up. And Dr. Tillis, I don't know if you want to come up and join us as well for any questions anyone has, or?
I have heard and read a few different times that children who have ADHD oftentimes are developmentally delayed. I'm wondering what your experience with that is. I have a 17-year-old that does have ADHD. Seems more like he's 13 or 14. Makes things hard.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, yeah. I definitely relate to that on a personal level as a parent. I think there's a lot we would say about that, and John, feel free to jump in too because you have a lot of expertise in this.
Maybe repeat the question.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So we were asking about children with ADHD and developmental delays. Do you see that? Absolutely. So there are, when we look at the neurobiology of the brain with ADHD, there are absolutely and can be developmental delays, as well as, some of the markers of ADHD being compulsion, right? So difficulty with navigating compulsions to do things. And we also see that there are some differences in the brain. 100%, I would say yes, there are developmental delays. I see that with my son too. I would tell you the flip side of that, so loving someone, my partner has ADHD and has his whole life. There are astounding strengths and intelligence that come with being neurodiverse. And so, my partner is now this CFO who thinks 10 years beyond anyone else. Despite those experiences. So what I would just want you to hear is hang in there. Yeah. And I think my son too, I'm like, he's gonna be doing something wild someday. And there's some challenges, but John, you really could speak to this well too.
So that's my research agenda. So I research folks with ADHD and folks with learning disabilities. What we see is like a discrepancy. So they'll usually have like actually strengths or might actually be gifted in one area, but actually be deficit in another. So I think it's really important to kind of look at that. What I tell parents that are freaked out about their kids, rightly so, is sometimes they just need the gift of time. They just need the gift of time. And I know that's hard because you want to help them, but they need the gift of time. And I tell Jessie that her kiddo is going to be the next Elon Musk. I don't know if that's good or bad, but there's truth to that. Like, when I worked in the ERs, there was this one doctor where I was like, this person always losing their keys and like just papers were everywhere. But like when there was an emergency and like someone's life needed to be saved, that was the guy I wanted because the dopamine and everything actually regulates him and makes him actually be great in crisis situations. So this is where like a lot of times still need intervention, still need treatment, and the gift of time.
Absolutely. And the other thing I would say just for anyone who has a neurodiverse kiddo that I really, like you said, on that gift of time of like, those children tend to find their strengths and really balance out with the right support and resources also to give you support. You go to counseling, get support, go to peer groups, things like that. Like you deserve that support. And I think it's almost hardest on parents for a long time. And so, yeah, I think that's what I would say about it. I will say, in terms of unusual strengths, I swear my kid and my husband are both some of the sharpest intuitive readers of people I know. Sometimes I'm like, I'm the counselor. Like my husband will they're wildly intuitive about people. So it's funny to just see people's different strengths come up. But what other questions? You want to jump in, John? I can follow up or...
Yeah, so I have a lot of experience at failing. So it's interesting because I have a lot, do you? Okay, that's awesome. So I have a lot of compassion actually for folks with perfectionistic tendencies. I don't have them because I failed my whole life. I was in special education K through 12. So like even going to college wasn't really on my pathway. So the fact that I'm a department chair at Regis University and I worked at the University of Denver, Northwestern, Johns Hopkins, it's kind of cool, right? And what I realized,
Yes,
oh well, thanks,
I agree.
yeah, appreciate that. What I realized is like the experience that I had are really a gift because I had a lot of experience failing. So like in my PhD program, when they're like, you're a bad writer, this isn't gonna work, I'm like, yeah, I know, like, we'll figure it out, because I always have, right? Why I feel so deeply for folks that have those perfectionistic tendencies is they haven't had the experiences of failing like I have. So what we need is to give them more experiences in which they can fail and we can like empathize. So how can you give folks those experiences to fail? And like fail greatly, right? Go do it, you know? Let me tell you, I've done it a lot. And later in life, it just is so, it plays out so well because life is a lot of disappointment, right? There's a lot of joys too, but a lot of disappointment. And learning how to roll with that is so important. So in summary, really trying to give them experiences and where they can fail, and you can be a safety net to help them process in that failure.
Mm-hmm. And I'm a firm believer in that modeling too, of they're watching what you do, you know, and not that it's always entirely related, but working on being compassionate with yourself, modeling that you're okay making mistakes, and I say that I'm a total perfectionist. John looked at me because it comes up in our partnership at work often. He's a get it out the door person. I'm like, no, I need 3 more hours to edit this.
We're such a good team because I'll write something, I'm like, this is horrible. And I'm not even talking bad about myself. Like, this is horrible, right? And then I'll send it to Jesse, who'll make it amazing. And like, back to neurologically diverse folks, I worked with someone with autism, and I sent something to them, and they were like, this is not good. And I'm like, I know, like, it's not. But like, that, how do we get to a point where we can keep going and surround ourselves with people that can help and things
And I
like
agree. I think, you know, a teen client came in the other day having a panic attack about college and her grades, and she just started sophomore year. And so I think we're seeing that the pressure is heightening. The fact, you know, my 4-year-old comes home with 5 sheets of homework every day. He's 4. And I'm like, this is not, we know developmentally that actually doesn't make sense. And kids' recess time is shrinking, things like that. So I do want to acknowledge too, I agree with you. And I think there's a lot that we're seeing. I think because of those hardships, because of that increased span, financially, the things we're seeing, I know that's probably like, it was sobering for me. I was like, oh wow, my kid's going to be in the house until he's 30. But I think that's part of the pressure and why people are pushing kids to figure it out sooner. And at the same time, I don't know that it's developmentally healthy for them. Other questions? Sorry. So the question was, you know, in this day of technology, the way that we've seen all these technological shifts, what kind of risk-taking do we see? And the truth is it's expanded massively. And what I think is the hardest and scariest is the implications and the consequences have expanded massively. So like automatically when you said that, I thought of sexting, right? And nude photos and things like that. Child pornography laws trying to catch up and shift to adjust to that. But the bottom line is now I feel for teens because they can make one stupid mistake that ends up on the internet that gets spread around the school. I think meeting up and online predators is another big thing. One thing I will say, again, trying not to horror story, but genuinely working at a sexual assault center for several years, Snapchat, anyone can locate you. So there is a way, unless you disable it, that your teens can be located by other people through their Snapchat. And I have worked with a teen client who was found by an adult predator by locating them through Snapchat and was assaulted that way. And so I say that not to be a horror story person, but to say I wasn't aware of that Snapchat had that capability. So that's something to be aware of. But yes, I think it's expanded so much, and the other painful thing is that the consequences are very lasting. Cyberbullying and the relationship between cyberbullying and depression is huge, and I see that a lot. I also just see, again, when we think about the increase in maturity and how much younger that's starting, I think that's also influenced by social media. I look at, there's jokes going around you've probably seen if you're on social media or things like that, but how I looked when I was 13 is not how 13-year-olds are dressing and looking today. It's changed massively over a very short period of time for everyone.
Oh yeah. So the question is like, where's the line between like these extremes around like allowing someone to fail in the perfectionism and how to kind of balance that, because there's like a theme of around like apathy, like folks just kind of giving up. Did I hear that correct? So I'll relate this to ADHD, actually. The best intervention, I think, with kids with ADHD in school is to hold really hard boundaries and be empathetic with it, right? So, sorry, my homework is late. Can I turn it in? No, you cannot. You cannot turn it in because I want you to be successful in the future and I'm worried you're going to get behind. So how can I go ahead and support you for the future? And the consequence is X, right? It's the natural consequence. So I think the best thing we can do is actually communicate high standards to folks, right? Back to my own story, right? Like, I kind of loved it for a while when people had low expectations of me. I was like, sweet, people have to learn like 20 spelling words and I only have to learn 3? That's amazing, right? But it didn't serve me well. Like later on, I had to go do that on my own, right? So I really do think that we need to think about what are like realistic standards that we have for folks. And with empathy, how do we hold people accountable to those and empower them to get there? That's my thing. So.
I agree. I think one of the things we're seeing that speaks to what you're saying is the term you probably hear is like helicopter parenting or enabling, right? And I work with a lot of parents who, again, with the best intentions, are really enabling their kids' negative behavior, I should say, to be clear. And so I think absolutely that part of that is no one learns without consequences, and we're protecting kids too much from those consequences that are survivable. And so if we constantly protect them, actually we can really harm them because we protect them, we say, oh, it's okay, it's okay, you can turn in. And then suddenly someone slams on them, right? Or I think even a lot of clients I work with in general, when we struggle with putting down boundaries, we don't, and then suddenly we just slam down on someone, and that's completely unexpected for them and they're not prepared for it. And so I agree, I think consistency is super important. And I think helping parents and caregivers, teachers, everyone work through what emotionally causes them to want to enable or helicopter parent. Like we have to be aware of where that pull is for us. And I think calling up to your standards. I mean, people rise to the standards that you provide for them.
And not to go on, but like when I became department chair, I think students were a little surprised because I kind of hold the line more than people think, because like they have me in class and I'm pretty empathetic and I do feel what my students feel. So then when they come and they're like, and they fail the class and they want to appeal the grade, our department had a history of like, okay, and I don't. I don't. I hold the line and then I empathize with them and then I'm like, how can I help support you to reach this bar?
Yeah. And I think it looks different for every youth too. I think about as a therapist, as this kind of third party who's involved in this teen's life, thinking about those kids where they're, I've had some clients who are working through problematic behaviors, and I know at home they, and parents are working through it. I'm talking with them about this, but historically that child has been shamed or really beaten on emotionally for every mistake they make. So I might balance that as being the more compassionate, empathic person who's kind of supporting them and being a little more lenient at first, right? I think about the one client I'm talking about. And then other clients, maybe they have a lot of that support and ability to make mistakes and they're getting a lot of nurturance in their family. So then maybe you're that person as a teacher or other caregiver who comes in and holds the line a little more. So I also think it's important to think about what their environments are like and how do you give them some balance in that would be the last thing I would say. But yeah, it's so true. I think that's a real challenge that we're facing. I also think education and things like that, this is another side note, but it's becoming very consumer driven, which is an odd experience. We're seeing it in higher education. I think it's happening in great education as well. But that's like a whole nother conversation we could have.
So we got, yeah.
I want to be respectful of people's time. Thank you all so much. I'm fine. I'll be
Yeah.
here to answer other questions. But if anyone needs to go, please feel free. Thank you.